You're at a dinner table. Everyone's talking, laughing, interrupting each other, and there's one person at the end who hasn't said much. Not because they're bored, not because they're shy exactly, but because they've already clocked the tension between two people across the table that nobody else has noticed yet. They heard the slight edge in that one sentence 20 minutes ago. They've been quietly assembling a picture that the rest of the room doesn't even know exists. And the strange thing is, they're completely comfortable. They're not waiting for a gap to speak, they're watching. And for them, that's enough. If you are that person or you know that person, this video is going to feel uncomfortably specific, because what's actually happening inside a mind like that is not what most people assume. It's not shyness, it's not social anxiety necessarily, it's not even introversion in the casual way people use that word. It's something more particular than all of those. And once you understand the real mechanism, a lot of things about yourself or the person you're thinking of are going to start making a different kind of sense. Let's start with what's actually happening in the brain, because there's a real neurological basis here, and it matters. There's a concept in neuroscience called sensory processing sensitivity. It was formally identified by psychologist Dr. Elaine Aron, and it describes a trait found in roughly 15 to 20% of the population, where the nervous system processes incoming information more deeply than average. Not just emotional information, everything. Sound, light, social cues, the subtle shift in someone's tone of voice, the micro-expression that crossed someone's face before they arranged it back into something neutral. For people with high sensory processing sensitivity, the brain doesn't just receive information, it immediately begins cross-referencing it against everything else, against past patterns, against what was said earlier and what wasn't said at all, against the gap between what someone's face is doing and what their words are claiming. The silence of the observer is not emptiness, it's full processing. They're quiet because their brain is genuinely busy, running a continuous, involuntary analysis that other people simply aren't running at the same depth. And that analysis needs space, it needs quiet. Talking interrupts it. Here's something that nobody tells you about people like this. They usually grew up in environments where reading the room wasn't optional. Maybe the household was emotionally unpredictable, not necessarily in a dramatic way, sometimes it was just subtle. A parent whose mood could shift without warning, a home where you had to gauge what kind of day it was before you could relax, a childhood where paying close attention was the thing that kept you okay. When attention becomes a survival tool early in life, the brain optimizes for it. You get very, very good at noticing. And then you grow up and the environment changes, but the skill doesn't downgrade. Psychologists who study early emotional environments describe this pattern as hypervigilance that outlives its original context. The threat dissolved, the scanning never stopped. But here's the distinction that matters, and it gets missed constantly. For most silent observers, this doesn't feel like fear. It doesn't feel like bracing for something. It feels like curiosity. It feels like interest. What started as a protective mechanism quietly evolved into a genuine way of experiencing the world, because the brain is efficient. It doesn't maintain systems it can't make useful, so it turned vigilance into fascination. There's a term in psychology called theory of mind, which refers to the ability to attribute mental states to other people, to understand that someone else has a different set of thoughts, feelings, and intentions than your own. It's a fundamental cognitive capacity, but like most things in human psychology, it exists on a spectrum. Research consistently shows that people who spend more time observing social environments rather than performing in them tend to develop a more sophisticated and accurate theory of mind. They're better at predicting how someone will react before it happens, better at identifying the real emotional content of a conversation underneath the surface content, better at knowing when someone says they're fine and means they're absolutely not fine, and knowing specifically which flavor of not fine it is. This is not intuition in the mystical sense. It is pattern recognition operating at high speed on a large dataset, years and years of watching people, quietly, carefully, without the distraction of needing to be seen at the same time. The cost of it, though. The cost is specific. When you process everything this deeply, small things land with a weight other people don't experience. A comment that everyone else at the table forgot by dessert is still turning over in your head at midnight, not because you're fragile, but because you caught something in it that the person who said it may not have even been conscious of. You're not being oversensitive, you're being accurate at a resolution that isn't always comfortable. There's also this particular kind of exhaustion that comes with it. Not physical tiredness, exactly, more like the sensation of having been in a loud room for a long time, even when the room was technically quiet. Social environments that other people find energizing can leave the silent observer drained in a way that's hard to articulate, because they weren't just present in the room, they were processing the entire room, constantly, in real time, at a depth most people don't access at all. And the loneliness of it is specific too, not loneliness from lack of people, but a persistent low-level awareness that most conversations are happening on a surface you can see through. You're present in the conversation, and you're also watching the conversation. And the gap between those two things is something you carry alone, because it's almost impossible to explain without sounding arrogant, and you know that, so you say nothing, and you watch instead. Here's something worth sitting with because it trips people up. Being a silent observer does not make you right. That point matters enormously, and the best observers understand it completely. You can be extraordinarily attuned to patterns of human behavior and still fundamentally misread any specific moment. Awareness is not the same as accuracy. The brain that notices everything also has a relentless need to make meaning out of what it notices, and sometimes it constructs a narrative that is sophisticated and detailed and completely wrong, because it filled in the gaps with assumptions instead of asking questions. Research in social cognition describes this as the accuracy-confidence gap, where high perceptiveness can actually increase confidence in incorrect interpretations, precisely because the thinker has more data points to build the story from. More evidence, more coherent the narrative, even when the narrative is wrong. The silent observers who actually use this trait well, the ones who turn it into something real, have learned to hold their perceptions like hypotheses, not verdicts. They've learned to stay curious about what they see instead of immediately deciding what it means. They ask one more question. They let the picture be incomplete a little longer. That discipline is hard to build, and it makes all the difference. There's also this specific relationship silent observers tend to have with words. They don't waste them, not because they have nothing to say, quite the opposite. It's that they've thought about what they'd say at a level of depth where most versions of it don't feel worth releasing yet. They know what a word lands like. They know the weight of a misread sentence. They've watched enough conversations to understand that speaking carelessly costs something, and they're not willing to pay that price. This gets misread constantly. The quiet person in the meeting is not disengaged. The friend who listens more than they talk is not indifferent. The person who sends you 3 sentences after 2 days is not cold. They're just precise. When they do speak, you should probably pay attention, because what they've chosen to say out loud has been through a filter that most people don't have. There's one more thing that doesn't get said enough about this, and I want to say it clearly. The depth with which silent observers experience other people is real, and it is a form of care that goes completely unnamed. They notice when you're carrying something you haven't mentioned. They remember the detail you said once, months ago, that you assumed didn't register. They see the version of you that you're trying not to show, and they don't use it against you. They just quietly hold it, and they keep showing up. That's not a small thing. That's actually quite rare. The world tends to reward people who speak first and loudest. It has very little formal language for the person who sits at the edge of the room and understands it completely. But the absence of that language doesn't mean the absence of that capacity. It just means it tends to move quietly, like everything else about the people who have it. If you watched this entire video and felt a particular kind of recognition, not the interesting kind, but the kind that made something in your chest relax slightly, the kind that felt like someone finally said the thing plainly, then you already know which person I'm describing, and you've probably known for a long time.